Welcome. Today's topic is an introduction to trauma for facilitators of all kinds, whether that be yoga teacher, trainer, coach, breath worker. I can see teachers. That's great. You'll get a lot from it if you're a parent. You'll get a lot from it if you're a human being. Who won't get a lot from it? Let's be really clear who it's for and who it's not for. So in this 90 minutes, it won't be like a super geek out for people who are already trauma therapists, okay? If you're already a trauma therapist, then I'd say it's probably going to be a bit low level for you. We're not going to be looking at the sort of finer points of Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory or anything like that. It would just be the basics. I'm really good at doing the basics well on this topic. The other thing I would say is this isn't a healing session. So if you have your own trauma, many of us do, this session isn't here to, it's not group therapy. So definition of trauma: overwhelming stress, this sense of powerlessness. Lots of definitions out there. If there's any therapists here, feel free to put yours in the chat, but I like this one of just the fight flight response, getting stuck in the system. And obviously we're in weird conditions to talk about stress and trauma. I think I did this slideshow at the beginning of COVID, but a lot of people are right now not getting the social support they normally get, what's called co-regulation, which immunizes people against trauma, which makes us less stressed. Luckily, I saw a friend today, I had a hug from a friend, had a hug from my wife. We've got quite a lot of this today, but not everyone in watching is in that same place. So the symptoms I mentioned: hyper-arousal, that could look like sleeplessness, anxiety, quickness to anger, hypervigilance, there's a bunch more. Avoidance, so that could be emotional avoidance, like self-medication, like drinking too much, or an emotional numbing. Numbing I've mentioned as a key one here, really. So those of you interested in embodiment, which I guess is many of you if you're following my work, trauma and embodiment don't go together. So embodiment can treat trauma, but also trauma stops people feeling their bodies, make people check out. And you can think of some of these symptoms as sort of like survival responses, right? Like if you're being attacked by a lion, to totally not be in your body and to be somewhere else, totally dissociated, is a very very, very helpful thing at the time, right? Who really wants to be feeling their body when a lion's chewing your leg off or something? So these trauma symptoms come from adaptive evolutionary responses, and there is a neuroscience behind them. We're not going to go into that today. You could look up Stephen Porges and the polyvagal nerve and things like that. You can think of it as the more reptilian or cruder parts, older parts of your brain taking over, and the executive functioning, the neocortex, being less active, not exactly being turned off. But it's think about this: when you're really stressed, it's hard to think, isn't it? Also, some of that human connection system is turned off. So this is why trauma is so toxic to relationship. This is why you'll see a lack of trust in traumatized countries. You'll see that in Israel and in Russia, actually, a sort of suspiciousness. This is why it can be a problem for people's sex lives or people's parenting, because that social engagement system is not so engaged and people are more in that fight or flight. There's a whole load of other symptoms, though: reliving things, like constantly thinking about things, flashbacks, though they're not as common as they are famous, and other reactions, stuff around memory. So, for example, kids sometimes show up as being abused when they start doing worse in school. And they go, well, why aren't they learning things? What's going on? It's because, the brain just can't take in new stuff. The brain is not wired for that when it's traumatized. Okay, so for trainers, empathize, be nice to people. If someone comes and discloses a violation or something to you that happened to them, and students will do that when they trust you, particularly if their boundaries are a bit ski-whiff, then not be nice to them, empathize with them, connect with them. Obviously you need to have the capacity to do that. Stabilize them if that's helpful. A bit of centering, feet on the ground, belly breathing, stabilization techniques, and then refer them to a qualified person if that's not you. ESR. Can you all remember that? If you take nothing away from today, take that away. So if someone comes up to Karen and she's been teaching them no pose with embodied yoga principle, which is quite triggering, no pose, and twice after teaching it, I've had people disclose rapes to me. They've come up to me, even as a man, and talked to me about it, 2 women, which is quite a difficult disclosure. And I've tried to do my best to be sympathetic, to get them back in a place where they can pick their kids up from school or whatever they've got to do next. And then I've given them the number of a trauma therapist who I trust. Yeah, this is also why I wouldn't rush off at the end of a workshop. This is also another thing I do is gatekeeping. So I come to a workshop and I meet people and I shake their hands. And this is one of the difficulties with Zoom. And if they seem like they're really under-resourced, I say, you know what, can I give you your money back? You might just want to go for a walk in the park today. You might just want to go relax, take a day off. Maybe this is not the right time. Common mistakes, consent. Okay. So not giving proper consent. As I said, people think they're doing consent, but often it's compliance. Not touching without consent is one I have to train a lot of my students out of, particularly if they're from more tactile cultures, like Mediterranean or South American students. I have to really train them out of that one. It's not to make touch weird or bad, but just to kind of bring an awareness to it. Actually, maybe COVID has brought a bit more awareness to people's sense of boundaries and touch. Actually, it's maybe one positive. I've seen people be a bit more cognizant of that. Losing the warmth or the authority. So teachers either becoming very serious or very authoritarian, both mistakes, right? Taking it personally when you have a traumatized student who does something that's really not cool. Yeah. It's a really interesting question, actually, when someone does something unpleasant to you as a teacher, or there's a, awkward student, difficult student, is to go, okay, what was their childhood like that meant that that's how they respond, that's how they relate to teachers? Yeah. And Paul Linden was incredibly patient with me because I actually had a really bad experience with teachers all through my secondary school. For 5 years, I was in this horrible British school and I just fucking tortured by teachers. And it took, a lot of patience for Paul, because here's what trauma does. I would react to Paul as if he was people from 20 years ago. Trauma takes people out of the present and into the past. Now, not always as literally as like a flashback. You've probably seen that on movies, right? Someone thinks they're in Iraq or something, but they're acting as if, and even in small ways, like, here's an interesting one. Every partner you've ever had treats you as you, but also as a combination of every other partner they've ever had. Okay, so let's say I was in a relationship with Steve, God forbid, okay? If Steve's had loads of traumatic boyfriends before him, or girlfriends, whatever, if I'm in a relationship with him, that's gonna come in our relationship. Okay, and gradually we can sort of recondition Steve and build trust. And if I'm patient, it's a really good question as a teacher is this them or their history talking? Yeah. Another one is that we regress with trauma responses. So one of my friends was a therapist. She used to say to me in her Irish accent, she'd say, "How old are you now, Mark?" And I'd be like having a little 10-year-old tantrum or a 15-year-old teenage pushback or something, or I'd be like a randy 15-year-old or something, And she'd say, "How old are you, Mark, now?" And I'd say, "I'm 10. And I'd sort of realize that I was acting from this sort of historical self that had been sort of frozen in place by trauma and was now acting out, the Americans call it. It's quite a good phrase. Yeah. Perception of history talking, not the actual reality. So one of the wonderful things about trauma healing is you get more in contact with reality. State chasing is like, you'll see this like conscious dance and breath work, like trying to get everyone high and getting really addicted to being high, as opposed to sort of more subtle things. So that's one. I've mentioned ethics, and I'll say ethics for fuck's sake, because this kind of, it's like, haven't we learned this yet? And it's pretty much like every major yoga school in the Western world has had either sexual or physical abuse scandals, including Pattabhi Jois, Iyengar. There's been so many. Bikram. Good. How might we release trauma? Yes, we should come to trauma treatments before the end of this. So treatments exist is the good news, okay? The good news. There's lots out there. Many things work. Eye movement, EMDR, somatic experiencing, and offshoots of that. Hear very good things about NAM and organic intelligence. TRE, that's a shaking technique. Alana Stefani, someone I've liked what she did. I mean, there's so many good stuff out there. And, sometimes treatment to animals or nature, spirituality can be a part of it. Social support's a big part of it. But basically there are the key thing to know is that it's not hopeless and there's things you can do. Okay. And you could refer people to some of these things. You could explore them yourself. There's many modalities out there. Remember when I was in the Ukraine, it was 2 days before my wedding, and my wife said, "Oh, can you come and talk to my ex-hairdresser? Because he got made to fight in the war, and now he's all fucked up. Can you come and talk to him?" I said, "Okay, yeah, I don't mind talking to him." So I turned up, and he was there with like 30 of his friends. And there's all these soldier guys, and they said, "Oh, we heard that you're a real man and not like these other therapists." And I'm like, because my wife told them I was a martial artist and a tough guy, so they kind of were going to more likely to listen to me. I was like, "Fucking hell, I have to, okay, hold this one up." And so I just shared my experiences of working in war zones, so they came to trust me, and they were like, "Okay, maybe this guy does know what he's talking about. You know, he's got experiences that are not the same as ours as soldiers, but are similar enough." And you know, and I came, and then I said, "Look," I talked through the symptoms, and I remember one guy going, "Oh, that's why I've been started hitting my kids. I never used to hit my kids before. I get so irritable these days. I get so angry, and I always feel ashamed after I hit them, you know." And one guy was like, "Oh, that's why I can't fuck my wife." And another guy was like, "Oh, that's why I'm drinking too much," you know. And it was making sense of a lot of what they were doing. They just didn't understand what they'd been doing since they got back from the war. And people know there's a war going on in the Ukraine. They probably don't even know that there's a war in the Ukraine, like right now. Yeah, it's basically a Russian proxy war. And then at the end of it, I said, "Look, and there's things you can do." And my wife's a psychologist, so she gave me the numbers of some local people. And they said, "Okay, this therapist is there's one called Mama Tornado is her name, that works for the military in the Ukraine." And they said, this one you can really trust. And my wife vouches for her, and we know she's good. And because they then trusted me, they went and talked to that therapist and got a number and started asking for help. And she was telling them about self-help groups and classes. But the first thing they needed was just the basics of the education. It took me less than an hour. I only had an hour. I was getting married in 2 days. I was busy, right? And it was like, they just needed the basics of the education. They needed a bit of sympathy, a bit of empathy. They needed to talk to someone that didn't judge them for the sort of some of the stuff they were doing. And they needed to be referred to someone local who was helpful. Do you have a simple technique for young traumatized children? Love them. There's my simple technique. Love them as much as possible. Regulate yourself as much as possible. If you can't convey it to them verbally, you have to convey it through the body. So traumatized cats and children, best thing you can do is work on your own trauma and regulate through you. That I'd say was a key thing. Be impeccable with consent. So one of the things I've been doing to my niece since she was a very young child is I'd always ask her before I pick her up. Yeah. What am I teaching her when I do that? Why am I trauma-proofing my niece when I do that? When I say, "Hey, Jessica, can I give you a hug?" Even though she always says yes, and she always wants me to turn her upside down and do crazy shit, right? Why do I always ask? Because I'm teaching her about consent through example. Okay? So I'm an influential man in her life. I'm giving her the sense that she has choice about her own body and who touches her body. I wonder why might that be useful for her. I hope it never is, but let's be honest, in a few years' time, it probably fucking will be, won't it? Right? Some spotty teenage boy is going to try and touch her the wrong way, and she's going to fucking punch him on the nose. Because she's going to be like, "What are you doing not respecting my bodily integrity? I've been brought up to think that this is totally absurd." Yeah? Make sense? So we can train children to understand their own boundaries, their own choice, that their body's their business in ways that it's not weird. I'm not sitting her down and talking to her about trauma. I'm just asking before I hug her or ask her before I pick her up. Yeah. Cool. Stuff like that. So we always end these workshops by unmuting, and then we say either thank you, goodbye, or fuck off if you want to practice your boundaries in our first language. Okay, that is the choice. Okay, you get a choice of one of the three. Don't take it personally if you hear other people saying fuck off. They're just practicing their boundaries, which is helpful. Hope you enjoyed today. So on three, Steve, let's unmute everyone and we can leave it there for today. Thank you, Steve, for looking after us. Thank you, Karen, for assisting. We have a bit of love for Karen before we end. Love for Karen, a bit of love for Steve. Sarah on our social media is here. Agatha, who does all the customer support and deals with your ridiculous questions when people don't read the sales pages properly, from Poland. So lots of love to everyone. Let's leave it there. Thank you, everyone. Thank you and goodbye. Thank you.